And now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Mijo Lee. Mijo is Executive Director of Social Justice Fund Northwest, a community foundation that funds grassroots movements for social justice. Except for 5 years in New York, she is a lifetime Northwesterner. As an activist and organizer, Mijo has worked in a variety of movements, including domestic violence advocacy, fair trade, police accountability, immigrant rights, and youth organizing, and also as an appellate public defender. She loves helping people realize their power as fundraisers, donors, and activists. Mijo lives in South Seattle with her teenage son and loves watching superhero movies, singing 80s rock ballads in karaoke, and baking pie. Will you please join me in welcoming Mijo?
Hello, good afternoon. It is an honor to be out here celebrating the work of the Peace and Justice Action League of Spokane. Even though I came from Seattle, I am a huge fan of this organization and its work. A huge fan of you all because I know that you are PJLs. As an organizer and an activist, as well as a funder, I'm committed to supporting the work of grassroots movements around the region. I know that PJLs and organizations like it are essential to the health of a strong social justice movement. And that's why I work for a regional organization, an organization that's committed to funding beyond the major urban centers. That's why I believe in PJLs. That's why I'm here today, because I want to win. Do you want to win? Do you though? Do you want to win? Yes. Okay, excellent. I do too. I want the example that Spokane can set for the rest of the state and the country through visionary policy wins like smart justice, like the most progressive tax structure in Washington, and I want the game-changing influence that you can have on the rest of the state. Washington's disparities in incarceration, education, housing, healthcare, income are unconscionable. I'm not going to rattle off statistics. I'm going to trust that you all already know that, or you probably wouldn't be here. I want statewide policy changes that eliminate those disparities and make Washington a place where every single person has food to eat, a safe place to sleep, an education that respects their humanity, the freedom to walk down the street without fear. Do you want that? All right. If we want that, it's about power. If we want that, we need to shift the balance of power in this state. And from west of the mountains, I know that in order to do that, we need you. We need people in the legislature who share our values of respect and inclusion and compassion and true democracy. But just as importantly, we need grassroots organizations on the ground building and strengthening the base that allows those individuals to fight and to win. What I'm talking about, of course, is organizing. Organizing means, first and foremost, being led by those most impacted by injustice. Centering the leadership and the experiences of those most impacted is a question of self-determination, of being the right thing to do, but it's also what actually works. Because people on the receiving end of injustice have invaluable expertise about the problems and the strategies that have already failed, and those that have actually succeeded, and those that need a chance and the room to experiment and grow. Out of necessity, people most impacted have unbelievable resilience and ingenuity. The ability to solve the enormous social problems we face actually already exists in our communities, but only organizing can make it possible. In the US, in Washington, in Spokane, right here, right now, people of color are disproportionately impacted by every issue you can think of. And that's why centering the leadership and experiences of people of color is an essential component of organizing in a social justice movement. But that doesn't mean that white people should just step back and ask people of color to drive. It's actually more difficult than that. It means that white people need to be collaborators. It means white folks fill up the tank and put air in the tires, load up the bus, and then get another bus when that bus is full. Take shifts driving when asked, but never forget that the experts, the ones who really know how to read the map, are those who know racism inside and out. We ride together, sometimes in the same bus, sometimes in caravans, but we ride together, whether the roads are dry and smooth or full of potholes. And organizing means fundamentally that you're never on your own. So speaking of buses, Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired seamstress who'd suddenly had enough, as many of us were taught in elementary school. Rosa Parks was an organizer who had trained and strategized for that moment, and who took an incredible risk knowing she was part of an organization and a larger movement, so that when she sat down, she didn't do it alone. When we set up individuals to act solely as individuals, we set ourselves up to lose. As individuals, we might win short-term victories, but on our own, we cannot defend them. If we elect someone as a champion of our values and causes, but we don't back them with an organized, politicized, mobilized base, what do we expect them to achieve? If they don't have that base behind them, what are they going to tell their opponents and their colleagues? If their constituents aren't engaged loudly and visibly articulating their demands and backing those demands with power, what will our champions have to stand on? Who will push them to push the envelope? If we ask people of integrity to step up, expose their lives and families, and be targets of increasing vitriol, do we also ask them to have the courage to do this without an organized base behind them? That kind of base doesn't come from campaigns, it comes from organizations. And when our elected officials falter, when they make mistakes or bargains that are short-sighted or ill-informed, or if they're just not the people we thought they were, who reminds them what they promised to be? That kind of accountability only comes from organizations. And who are the next leaders? I mean the people running in the next election now, but I also mean the people managing their campaigns and knocking doors on their precincts and building relationships with the activists on the ground, and the ones in the election after that, and the one after that, and the one after that, and the one after that, because you best believe that the right wing has been thinking that far ahead for a very long time. Where do the next leaders learn those skills? Where do they develop their political analysis? Where do they come to see themselves as leaders? Those leaders come from organizations. That base, that accountability, that leadership comes from the invaluable resource of having an organization in your community that sticks around, that lasts much longer than an election cycle, that will continue to do the work year after year through times of outrage and times of apathy, when the money flows and when it doesn't. From my vantage point, being able to fund and get to know dozens of organizations across a 5-state region, I can tell you that most communities in our regions do not have that. You are very lucky, Spokane. You have Pajals. Yes. So don't take that for granted. And I know that you all took time out in the middle of your day to be here, so I know you appreciate this organization. And later, when the ask comes, I hope you'll join me in showing them that love. Because yes, we absolutely need to donate to candidates, but if we don't give to organizations too, might as well be rowing your boat with one oar. You're not getting very far. Spokane is lucky to have someone holding it down for community organizing. And I know one of the hard things about organizing is that it can be a long time before we see the fruits of our labors. It can take a lot longer than an election cycle. It can take years, it can take generations. But when we invest in organizing with our time, energy, and money, we know we're investing in leadership, in stronger communities, but we don't know if or when we'll achieve the changes we seek. It's like driving up a curvy road, unable to see around the bend, having faith that the road will take us where we need to go. It can be tempting to consider a more straightforward route to a less ambitious destination, where at least we know where we're headed. But we've all driven across mountains, right? So we all know the only way to the top is on a curvy road with all the uncertainty that entails. So with all that uncertainty, how do we know that organizing works? On Friday, I watched in amazement as Kim Jong-un stepped over a small concrete strip into South Korea and awkwardly shook Moon Jae-in's hand. Other people watch this video? Okay. I don't know if anybody else here was affected by it like I was, but my jaw literally dropped as I watched them gingerly hold hands and then walk together into North Korea, and then promise peace. Now, to be clear, all we have so far is words and symbolism, and there's a lot of room for this to go horribly wrong. I have no illusions about that. But words and symbolism matter, They create space for action, they create potential, and these are words and symbolism that we have never had before. For over 70 years, Korea was divided, a casualty in a war between superpowers. But for just as long, everyday people have struggled and fought for Songnyeong, peaceful reunification. For decades, on both sides of the border, people have sacrificed their jobs, their families, their freedom, and their lives for this cause. I have two close friends whose fathers were imprisoned and blacklisted for their reunification activism. Many friends who have dedicated their lives here and in Korea for this movement. And I have friends who were among the millions who took to the streets last year and successfully ousted the conservative, anti-democratic president, which is why there is now a President Moon. So when I watched those two powerful men in suits, men capable of killing millions, holding hands for their historic walk, I didn't see them. I saw the faces that I know out of the countless activists who've worked for 73 years towards this moment. Powerful men in suits will generally get credit for these victories. Other powerful men in suits will try to take credit for these victories. But we know that changes that big can only come from small beginnings, from the grassroots. And that's how we know organizing works. Here in the Northwest, communities across the region are proving that change is possible this way, even now, even under these conditions. Just in the last few months, I know that in Oregon, a multiracial, multi-issue coalition was able to pass a statewide bill that provides reproductive health services like birth control, abortion, and postpartum care to thousands and thousands of low and middle income Oregonians. I know that in Montana, grassroots organizing recently defeated a ballot initiative that would have prevented trans folks from being able to use the bathroom when they need to use the bathroom, and that those same organizers are out there knocking doors right now, making sure that all Montanans will continue to have access to health care. I know that in Washington, the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network's Rapid Response Network has been literally stopping ICE in its tracks, preventing raids and deportations. I know that here in Spokane, why did I do that? Here in Spokane, you've had incredible victories, like the groundbreaking Fair Chance hiring win. So I know that all across our region, and there are so many examples, I could literally stand here for an hour and talk about it, but I'm not going to do that to you. You are part of a strong, vibrant movement, and victories are happening that most of us never get to hear about. And they happen because everyday people do stand up and stand together, and together we're bigger than those powerful men in suits. Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will." Organizing makes those demands coherent, strategic, and inescapable. And there's another component of organizing that's not talked about a lot. Or rather, it is talked about, but not explicitly. Maybe we're embarrassed because it's a little cheesy. Maybe we're afraid that we don't really have it. Maybe we take it for granted, which is something that we cannot afford to do. What I'm talking about is hope. I think we often think of hope as something that happens to us. It's a condition, a virus that we want to catch. What gives you hope? We ask each other, as if it's something that can only be passively received. But I've come to understand that hope is active. It's something that we have to build piece by piece every day. Not just because it feels good. Honestly, sometimes it doesn't feel good. Sometimes it just feels hard. Sometimes the world feels bleak. Pushing through the downpour of setbacks and assaults feels like too much, and hope can feel foolish at best and suicidal at worst. But in fact, it's very much the opposite. I've come to realize that hope is not a luxury. It's not something that we can afford when we have extra energy to spare. It is a strategic necessity. It is something we have to do, and practice and get better at so that our work is meaningful and effective. Hope is what we owe each other. I was raised by atheists, both of whom were raised by devout Christians. My mother among German Protestants in Indiana, my father in Korea, his grandparents being among the first Koreans to convert to Christianity. Me, with my godless upbringing, I have always been kind of fascinated by the idea of faith. And when I think about faith, more and more I think about my grandmother, my father's mother, Namkung Kyung-soo. As a young woman, Kyung-soo was already a fighter. During the Japanese occupation of Korea, she found ways to resist, big and small, but the small ways were big too. She and her uncle, another anti-occupation activist, were both school teachers, and I hope we all know all school teachers are potential organizers and potential revolutionaries. This isn't a story about my mom, but my mom was a teacher as well. I love teachers. So my grandmother was a teacher, and the kids in her class learned Korean history, which under the Japanese occupation was illegal. They sang Korean songs, which was illegal. Japanese soldiers dropping in on her class might have seen the girls diligently working on needlepoint, not noticing that the pattern was a prowling tiger, roughly in the shape of the Korean peninsula, which was a symbol of Korean nationalism. And my favorite story of her resistance, she grew and shared cuttings of the Korean national flower, which in English is called the Rose of Sharon. And I love that, because it's organizing. She was literally growing resistance and spreading it to others. And something so beautiful and so delicate was so dangerous to the authorities that it had to be outlawed. And for this, sharing flowers, she was arrested and jailed. World War II ended with the Japanese ousted from Korea, but independence was bittersweet, and in fact, some would argue it still hasn't happened. Because almost immediately, Korea was divided arbitrarily along the 38th parallel, and a few years later, the Korean War began. By that time, Kyung-soo had gotten married and had 2 boys, but her husband had left her and gone to Japan, of all places. But she wasn't alone, because she was an organizer. Her house was the meeting place for the militia that protected the fields from the armies of both sides. Every night, she made huge pots of rice for the men who would gather there before heading out, until they had to abandon their fields and head into the mountains as refugees. But she survived, and she made sure her children survived, and she sent them to the city and then to America. And in the meantime, she started organizing women. After the war, technically the war is still going, but after the troops withdrew, she walked all over the countryside, teaching women to read, registering them to vote for the first time, talking to them about their rights. And she became the first female pastor in Korea and founded a church. I visited that church. There's a plaque there dedicated to the founder, and the name on that plaque is actually a man's name, but we know. She died years before I was born, but I've been fascinated by these stories of Namkung Kyung-soo my entire life. She survived so much, but she did much more than survive. In conditions I can't imagine, she was determined to create a better world, not just for her children, but for all people. And I wonder why. I wonder what was the difference between her and someone else who made a different choice. She must have had nights of fear and despair. What drove her through those nights? Was it her faith that kept her going? And do I have that? Again, I was raised by atheists. Or if you catch my dad on a good day, he might say he's agnostic. But each for their own reasons. They became disillusioned with the church and with religion in general. So I was raised to think about service, to think about learning, working, sharing. I was not raised to think about faith or its role in my life. I've been thinking about faith more, as I think more about the strategic necessity of hope. For example, I believe we will end racism. I'm going to be specific. Note I didn't say a time period there, and I'm not going to say in my lifetime. And I don't think we'll ever eliminate individual prejudice, which is based on many things, including certain physical characteristics which are currently associated with race. That's not what I'm talking about. Racism, the insidious idea that those characteristics make some people less deserving of dignity and respect and basic human rights, and some people more deserving. And the systemization of that idea into our institutions and policies and cultures, that will end. It must end. Do I believe that based on hard evidence? No. Do I believe that based on personal experience? No. I believe it because I have a responsibility to. Because in order for it to become true, it must be believed. The future we want requires us to be hopeful. Only by believing it can we work it into being. My grandmother lived her entire life in a world that was ruled by the martial law of an imperialist power, then sliced in half against its will, then ravaged by war, then ruled by martial law again, this time homegrown and backed by another imperialist power, the US. I don't know exactly what she believed, only what she did, and her actions belie faith, a deep, abiding faith in a world more just, more peaceful than the only world she had ever known. Walida Imarisha, a poet, author, historian, and prison abolition activist in Portland, often says that to our ancestors, we are science fiction. We are creatures beyond their imagining. And Walida tells us all social justice work is science fiction. Because in doing this work, we are creating a world that none of us have ever seen. That's hard. Hope is hard work. But what joyful, creative, imaginative work we have decided to engage in. We practice that hope when we come together, just like this, and decide to commit to a future that we have not yet seen. Thank you.